I've cut my mother from my life, and I don't know if it was the right thing to do. Either way, I can't help but feel horrible about the situation. I may have posted something about this whole situation at some point in the past few years, not entirely sure, so I'll start from the top, because this whole situation is driving me mad and I need somewhere to vent, since my appointment with a psychologist won't be for another 2 weeks or so. I'm a 22-year-old male that suffers from Tourette's, Asperger's syndrome, ADHD, and anxiety, and lived with my mother up until late 2023, when my dad decided I couldn't live in that house anymore out of the sheer toxicity of my mom. Let me explain a bit. As far as I can remember, my household has always been a very toxic one, from my parents fighting every other day, to my sister bullying the FCK out of me due to my conditions, and finally my brother just being an asshole in general. Things started getting better as I got older though, with my brother and father at least. My brother grew out of being an asshole, and we had a really close bond the last several years before he passed, and my parents got separated, not divorced, almost a decade ago, and I've had a close bond with him ever since. Now, you'd think fighting would stop since my parents got separated, right? Welp, they didn't, and I soon realized that the root of all the problems was my mom, 'cause since she couldn't fight with my dad, she started picking fights with my older brother, and then he moved out 'cause he couldn't stand her bullshit, and then she started picking fights with my sister and I, until my sister got a scholarship to go studying abroad in Europe, which in turn led to all my mother's fights being with me, which is where I'll start going into a little more detail. I lived with my mom by ourselves for a good 2 or 3 years, and those were probably the most agonizing years in my life. As I described a little, my mom is one of the most toxic people I know, and she would shout her back off for anything that wasn't like she wanted it to be, to the point that several times my neighbors called asking what was happening, to the point that they almost called Child Protective Services, which didn't really work since I was over around 18 or 19 during the time this went down. But I digress. Anytime my mom came home and the dishes weren't washed or my bed wasn't made, she'd shout like a freaking banshee for hours on end, and being that I have a shopping list worth of special needs, I didn't react all that well, and by all that well, I mean I started shouting my frustrations the same way my mom did, and mess would just escalate and I'd end up breaking something. Didn't help that my sister was the same. There was this one time when I wanted to cook dinner, and my sister was also cooking dinner at the same time, and so wouldn't let me cook my dinner until she was finished cooking hers. Both her and I escalated conflict, because that's how it always ended. And while I don't remember a whole lot of that fight, I very vividly remember my sister taunting me to beat her, while my mom was a few steps away saying that she had the phone ready to call the police in case I tried something. This was pretty much my daily life up until September 2022, when my brother was admitted into the ER due to his heart conditions that he's had since he was a few months old, flaring up. Unfortunately, he passed away a few days later. Due to our financial situation, we decided to cremate his body instead of burying him, and we planted a tree with his ashes. I would like to note that my mother didn't attend that ceremony. She legitimately got there, handed me my brother's ashes, and left. Didn't even park the car, just sat inside her car in the driveway and left the second I took his ashes into my hands. I only found the reason for this after the ceremony, that she didn't attend the burial of my brother's ashes because my aunt was there. To give a little context, my aunt was the one my brother called to take him to the ER when his heart condition flared up. Says a lot, doesn't it? My mother and I like 2 blocks away from my aunt, and my brother's apartment was a few miles away. And on the drive to the hospital, my brother told my aunt of a lot, and I meant a lot of grievances he had about my mom, and when they got to the hospital, my aunt paid with her credit card, and when my mom got there, she wouldn't let her go in and see my brother, and so a big fight ensued. I don't know the details about that altercation, unfortunately. Before I continue, I would like to say that what my aunt did was completely inexcusable, and she should not have prevented my mom to see my brother. In no way am I excusing her behavior. Anyway, after I found out, I went to confront my mom about why she would let something so infantile from being at the burial of my brother's ashes. So she started dancing around the issue, explaining what really went down, and just trying to justify her actions, really. Again, I don't remember the details of that conversation. Aside from that, my mom ended up sobbing and claiming her children had abandoned her over my aunt. Normally, I would blow a fuse over stuff like that, but my brother literally died like 8 hours prior. So I really had no energy for that, and so I ended up leaving and locking myself in my room. A few weeks later, I found out the full story behind my brother, heart condition flaring up. Basically, a few months prior he had to go back to a lower-paying job due to his higher paying being so bad that he had an actual panic attack and had to be admitted into the hospital, which my mom used her credit card to pay. Having a lower-paying job meant my brother could barely afford his bills or rent, and my mom kept trying to charge him for the credit card usage on his hospital stay, which, as you can imagine, led to a lot of stress, which led to him starting to vomit, and he was vomiting his meds for his heart, which spiraled into being admitted into the ER and, eventually, passing away. Life continued as usual after that, and by as usual I mean my mom shouting her back off every other day for anything that she didn't like. Also, while all this was happening, my mom was basically leaving for free, since my dad paid for a good chunk of the stuff at home, and I paid for the rest. The things I paid for were food, TV, internet, anything related to taking care of my dog. And despite she never having to pay a dime for anything other than when food ran out a few days before my paycheck, she never, and I mean never, had money when I asked, outside of paying for food when we ran out before my paycheck, like I said. Despite having 2 jobs, and despite never having any money, she was able to afford 2 trips to the US and 1 to Europe that year. And when we confronted her about this, she claimed that her friends would cover the entire cost of all the trips. Not to mention that whenever she went out with her friends, which was every day, she would wear clothes that I had never seen on her before. Furthermore, whenever we asked, she would claim that they went to a disco, or a bar, or a fancy restaurant, and the only thing she ever ordered was a glass or 2 of water. Like, I'm not the smartest person around, but this just reeks of bullshit to me. Fast forward a few months of this, and my sister got holidays from her college and so came to visit, so she stayed in her old room in the house. A few days into her stay, and my mom announced that a few friends of hers that lived in the US were visiting, and she invited them to stay over at our place. Problem is, our house didn't have enough spare rooms for them to stay. The solution? Effectively kick my sister out of the house to offer her room over to her friends. Again, a massive argument ensued, of which I remember nothing, and my sister went to stay with my grandma during the remainder of her visit. My mom and my sister haven't spoken to this day because of that. After my sister left, life went on as usual until one day, during an argument with my mom. I don't remember about this one either, just that it was about me not washing the dishes. I got so angry that I kinda just blacked out for a few seconds, and when I came out, I had a glass plate on my hand and was about to bash my mom's head in with it. I managed to stop myself, thankfully, but I decided to nope out of there immediately. Meanwhile, my mom kept taunting me, because she thought I was just about to smash that plate into the wall or something, and locked myself into my room and called my dad, who decided I could not live there anymore, and so we started searching for apartments the very next day. He paid for everything for the new apartment, and I still owe him that money. Thankfully, he told me to pay it off if I could, and if I could to not worry about it. And so I started living by myself. My dad paid off the rent, and I paid for everything else, since my income wasn't enough to pay my rent. And I can tell you with certainty, these have been the best months of my entire life. There was just so much peace. I'd never felt better. Despite this, I still tried to maintain a healthy relationship with my mom. She would visit occasionally, and we would have dinner together. Also, after I moved out, my dad decided he could not be bothered to pay everything for my mom to live, and so he stopped paying her bills. I don't know what happened between the two of them during that time, since I didn't get involved in that whole mess. But yeah, life was well and good up until last November, where my mom told me that she had quit one of her jobs. I found it incredibly odd, considering she had mentioned multiple times that she was struggling financially, so her quitting her job just raised a huge alarm that something was going to happen. Turns out, I was right. A few months after that, early this year, if memory serves, my dad was hit with a lawsuit of, wait for it, $500,000 from my mom for abuse. All of which was fake. Of course, I read the whole thing. But the one single thing that infuriated me to no end was that she said that my dad and his family did not allow her to bury my brother. Yes, you read that right. She did not attend the burial of my brother's ashes and then had the absolute gall to claim it was my dad that didn't let her bury him. I don't think I've ever been so angry or hurt in my entire life. And yet, I tried to not let this get to me, and still tried maintaining a positive relationship with her. Welp, as of 3 weeks ago, I've effectively cut off all contact with her. The reason being that she now had audacity to hit my dad with another lawsuit, this time for a pension. Is that the right word? Not sure. It's the direct translation with the Spanish word, for $5,000 a month. The amount is actually a bit different because she's asking for a mix of USD and the local currency. Of course, my dad can't pay such a ludicrous amount a month, and so she demanded that he stop paying for my rent and give that money to her, which would render me homeless, since with my income I can't pay for rent by myself. Also, some of you might wonder how I can't even pay for my rent. The reason is that my dad specifically picked an apartment with 2 rooms in case my sister came to visit, since she's not in speaking terms with my mom. And since I live in a third world country, minimum wage jobs like mine pay stupidly low, and rent is stupid high. But yeah, after all this, my mom has shown that she gives zero attention about anyone but herself, giving that she's willing to make me go homeless. This isn't that big of an issue, because I have a lot of relatives who would be willing to take me in, but she doesn't know that, because her family doesn't really have any contact with her either, in order for her to live like a princess while someone else pays for all her mess. But yeah, that's about it. I had to go to a doctor the other day because of this whole cluster making me feel worse than a literal pile of poop. They made me take 2 weeks off work due to mental health and referred me to a psychologist, which I have an appointment with in about 2 weeks. I'm going to be real. I have no idea if this was the right choice. With this, my mom is essentially alone now, and I can't help but feel guilty over it. And yet, I think that this would let me get back on my feet at some point. I really don't know. I feel like complete garbage regardless. Sorry for such a long rant. I just really needed somewhere to vent where I could remain anonymous.